Emma and Ryan Colburn never imagined their quiet town would become a battlefield, but the night their father, Daniel Colburn, barricaded their home with a rifle in hand, their world turned into a fight for survival. In the quiet town of Silver Creek, life moved slowly. People knew their neighbors, doors were left unlocked, and children rode their bikes through winding streets without a second thought. Yet, on the far edge of this small community, there was a house that never quite fit the peaceful picture. It belonged to Daniel Colburn, a father of two whose name was known but never warmly spoken. From the outside, the Colburn family seemed normal enough. The home was modest, the children appeared in school photos, and Daniel held occasional jobs that kept him afloat. But anyone who looked closer noticed the cracks. Neighbors recalled how the curtains were always drawn, even on bright summer days when the rest of the street seemed to welcome the light. They remembered the way the children, Emma and Ryan, rarely joined others at the playground or birthday parties. On the rare occasions they appeared, their eyes carried a weight unusual for their age. They played in silence, glancing toward their father's car as if every minute away from him was borrowed time. Daniel's past was marked by shadows. He had once been a promising mechanic, but his temper drove away customers and destroyed relationships. Stories circulated of bar fights, angry outbursts, and nights in county jail. He was fiercely private, refusing visitors and cutting ties with relatives. When asked about family, he would give only short, sharp answers. His wife, who once lived in the house, had vanished years earlier, and no one dared to ask too many questions. Some whispered that she had escaped, while others feared she had met a darker fate. The truth was never confirmed, and Daniel never spoke of her again. Financial struggles added to his volatility. Bills piled up and jobs slipped through his fingers. Some suspected he turned to less honest means of earning money. Packages arrived at strange hours, and visitors came and went quickly, often leaving with items hidden under coats. Police patrols occasionally slowed near his street, but nothing ever came of it. To the people of Silver Creek, Daniel was a man best avoided, someone who existed on the edge of respectability and danger. Inside the house, life was far harsher than the community could imagine. Emma and Ryan lived under strict rules. They were told when to speak, when to eat, and when to remain absolutely silent. Daniel's moods shifted unpredictably. At times he appeared distant, lost in thought, staring at nothing for long stretches. At other moments he erupted with anger, smashing objects and slamming doors. The children learned to move quietly, to sense his temper before it broke. What no one saw was the growing pressure inside Daniel's mind. He felt wronged by the world, convinced that society had turned against him. The loss of his career, the whispers about his wife, and the quiet suspicion from neighbors all fed into his paranoia. He built a story in his head where he was not the villain, but the victim. It was a story that hardened with each passing year, preparing him for the moment when everything would shatter. It started with a string of burglaries across the county, thefts that baffled investigators and unsettled the community. Firearms, ammunition, and specialized equipment disappeared from storage units and small-town gun shops, taken with precision and without a trace of forced entry. The pattern suggested someone who knew how to bypass locks and security systems, someone patient enough to study routines and careful enough to avoid cameras. As weeks went by, the stolen weapons accumulated into a troubling stockpile, and the name Daniel Colburn began to surface in hushed conversations inside the sheriff's office. Daniel had always lived under suspicion, but this time the evidence was stronger. Anonymous tips claimed to have seen his truck near one of the break-ins. A pawn shop owner recalled him asking questions about scopes and suppressors, questions that hinted at more than casual interest. Detectives pieced together fragments of information, slowly building a case that pointed in his direction. With every lead, the picture grew clearer. Daniel was not simply a bitter man on the edge of society. He was arming himself, preparing for something far larger than a desperate attempt to make money. As the investigation deepened, Law enforcement worked carefully to avoid alerting him. Surveillance teams parked discreetly at the end of his street, tracking his late-night drives and irregular routines. Agents followed him into hardware stores, noting the purchase of heavy locks, chains, and rolls of thick black plastic. He was cautious, checking mirrors, scanning his surroundings, always looking for a tail. What investigators did not realize was that Daniel had already sensed he was under watch. Years of paranoia had sharpened his instincts. Every unfamiliar face, every car parked too long in the neighborhood, fed into his suspicion that the authorities were closing in. On the morning they chose to act, a warrant was signed and a small tactical team prepared to move. The plan was simple: catch Daniel off guard, arrest him quickly, and remove the children before they could be drawn into the chaos. But Daniel had spent sleepless nights pacing his home, preparing for what he believed was inevitable. Hours before officers arrived, he began dragging furniture to block the doors, stacking chairs, dressers, and even an old refrigerator against entry points. He nailed boards over the back windows and pulled heavy curtains tight across the front. To anyone watching, it looked like a man bracing for a storm. In reality, it was the first move of a siege. Inside the house, the atmosphere thickened with fear. Emma and Ryan watched their father transform the familiar rooms into barricaded chambers. He ordered them to stay close, his voice sharp, his rifle slung across his shoulder. He double-checked locks, loaded magazines, and whispered to himself about enemies waiting outside. When the sound of engines finally rolled down the street and the flashing lights appeared against the walls, Daniel was ready. Instead of surrendering, he gripped his children tightly, pulling them to the front of the house and positioning them where no bullet could reach him without striking them first. For the officers outside, the operation had shifted from a simple arrest to a nightmare standoff that would grip the entire town. The sun dipped low over Silver Creek as the police surrounded the Colburn house, casting long shadows across the quiet street. What began as a routine arrest spiraled into something much darker the moment Daniel revealed his intentions. At the front window, his children stood pressed against the glass, their small bodies trembling as their father loomed behind them with a rifle in his hands. The officers outside froze at the sight, realizing instantly that any wrong move could end in tragedy. The neighborhood, once known for its stillness, now pulsed with sirens, flashing lights, and the heavy silence of fear. Hours dragged on as the standoff solidified. Negotiators attempted to make contact, but Daniel refused to answer their calls. Instead, he paced inside, keeping his children close, shifting them from one room to another whenever he noticed a spotlight or the red dot of a sniper's scope sweep across a wall. The children had become his shield, his insurance against the storm gathering outside. Every officer on scene felt the same rising dread. They were dealing with a man who had nothing left to lose. By nightfall, news crews had arrived. Cameras captured the barricaded house, and images of Emma and Ryan pressed against the window spread across television screens nationwide. The public was horrified by what they saw, and the pressure on law enforcement grew heavier with every passing minute. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, exposing the outlines of officers crouched behind vehicles and trees. Inside, Daniel ranted in bursts, his words muffled but frantic, his gestures violent as he waved the rifle and pointed toward the windows. Investigators digging through his past during those tense hours uncovered a discovery that shifted the case entirely. They had assumed Daniel was stealing weapons to sell on the black market, a desperate man trying to claw his way out of financial ruin. But the truth was far more disturbing. Notes found in his abandoned workshop revealed names of local officials and dates connected to his old criminal cases. Maps with circled buildings and marked entry points suggested a planned series of attacks. The weapons he had stolen were not for profit. They were meant for revenge. This revelation spread quickly among the command team on site. They were no longer facing just a frightened father, but a man on the brink of unleashing calculated violence. As midnight approached, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He dragged his children from room to room, sometimes holding them so tightly they cried, other times leaving them momentarily alone as he rummaged through duffel bags of ammunition and supplies. He shouted at shadows outside, screamed at unseen enemies, and occasionally fell into eerie stretches of silence where he simply stared out the window, his children standing motionless in front of him. Every second was a gamble. The officers knew that a single misstep, a sudden noise, a misunderstood signal, could ignite the situation. The people of Silver Creek watched in disbelief as their town transformed into the center of a national crisis. What had started as a quiet investigation into stolen guns had spiraled into a spectacle of fear, rage, and helplessness. For Daniel, this was the stage he believed he had been preparing for all along, a final battle against a world he thought had betrayed him. For his children, it was a night of terror with no promise of escape. The night deepened, and the Colburn house seemed to breathe with tension. Inside, Daniel's movements became unpredictable, almost frantic. He no longer paced in a steady rhythm, but darted from room to room, dragging Emma and Ryan with him. Their small hands clutched his jacket, their faces pale and tear-streaked as they moved in unison with his paranoia. Every flash of light from outside, every distant sound became a threat in his eyes. He whispered warnings that no one could hear, crouched low, and trained his rifle toward the windows, convinced that intruders were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Outside, law enforcement intensified their efforts. Negotiators had shifted strategies, trying to engage him through recorded messages, phone calls, and even small gifts intended to calm the children. Every approach was met with resistance. Daniel refused to respond, refusing to yield even the smallest concession. Officers analyzed his behavior from a safe distance, noting patterns in his pacing, his attention to the children, and the careful positioning of his makeshift barricades. They realized they were dealing with a man who had rehearsed this scenario in his mind long before it became reality. The hours dragged on, and Daniel's desperation grew. He had barricaded the doors with furniture, nailed boards over the windows, and covered every glass surface with blankets, creating a labyrinth inside the house. He moved with calculated caution, yet there were moments of erratic impulse. At one point, he shifted the children to the attic, believing it offered more protection. At another, he rearranged rooms as if building a fortress within a fortress. Emma and Ryan were forced to follow silently, learning the precise steps of survival in the presence of their father's fear. Then came an unexpected development that changed the entire dynamic of the standoff. Investigators discovered a hidden cache of improvised explosives tucked in a closet on the second floor. The revelation sent waves of alarm through the tactical teams outside. Daniel was no longer merely armed with firearms. He had prepared for extreme measures, and the threat to everyone inside the house had escalated dramatically. Officers adjusted their positions, retreating to safer vantage points while attempting to maintain lines of communication. Every move Daniel made was now a matter of life and death, not just for the children, but for the law enforcement personnel surrounding the property. Despite the escalating danger, Daniel's focus remained intensely fixed on the children. He refused to let them out of his sight, dragging them through hallways and around furniture, keeping them between himself and any perceived threats. The sound of distant helicopters, the flashing lights, and the voices of negotiators outside became background noise to him, a world that had conspired against him for years. Inside, he was a man consumed by fear and anger, and the children were both shield and lifeline. As the night wore on, the community held its collective breath. Silver Creek's quiet streets, once filled with the sounds of ordinary life, now echoed with tension, sirens, and the whispers of reporters broadcasting the crisis to a nation. Every hour brought new uncertainty. Would Daniel surrender, or would his desperate measures spiral beyond control? Every observer knew that the next move could shatter the fragile balance between survival and disaster, and the night stretched endlessly as the standoff continued. By the early hours of the morning, the tension around the Colburn house had reached its breaking point. Daniel's energy, fueled by fear and anger, was beginning to fray. He had been pacing for hours, moving the children from one barricaded room to another, muttering to himself and occasionally gesturing at shadows he imagined lurking outside. The sounds of sirens, radios, and helicopters had become a constant drum in his ears, yet he remained fixated on keeping the children directly in front of him. Any perceived threat provoked a violent reaction, and every movement he made was unpredictable. The first sign of change came when a small fire ignited in the living room. A candle, left precariously on a makeshift shelf, had toppled onto papers and blankets, and flames began to lick the edges of furniture. Smoke filled the rooms, and the acrid smell spread quickly. Daniel, distracted at first, realized the danger only when the fire threatened to reach the children. Panic replaced his earlier bravado. He grabbed Emma and Ryan, shielding them as best he could while the fire grew, and moved them toward a narrow hallway. Outside, officers observed the flickering light through gaps in the curtains, realizing that the situation had become even more perilous. As the fire intensified, smoke detectors blared and alarms from nearby homes went off. Daniel's grip on the children remained tight, but his movements became increasingly erratic. In the chaos, he tripped over furniture, nearly falling with the children in his arms. Officers outside knew the moment had come to act. Using long-range tools and specialized equipment, they created diversions to draw Daniel's attention away from the exit. Negotiators spoke urgently, their voices amplified and calm, emphasizing safety and promising no harm to the children. Daniel hesitated, torn between fear for his own survival and the instinct to protect them. Then, in a sudden twist, Daniel made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of continuing to flee through smoke-filled hallways, he guided Emma and Ryan toward a back window. Officers had cleared the area and prepared to intervene, and as the children emerged, they were immediately swept to safety. Daniel followed only partially, retreating back into the house for a tense moment before surrendering himself. He was exhausted, covered in soot, and visibly defeated, but still clutching the rifle that had defined the standoff. In the aftermath, investigators pieced together the full scope of what had nearly occurred. Daniel had prepared for a series of violent actions that could have caused widespread harm. The stolen weapons and explosives were meticulously arranged for a plan that only the intervention of law enforcement and an unintentional fire had prevented. The children, though traumatized, had survived without physical injury, but their ordeal would leave lasting scars. The community of Silver Creek slowly exhaled, relief mingled with disbelief at the night's events. Daniel Colburn was taken into custody, his reign of fear at an end. Authorities reflected on how quickly ordinary life had shifted into chaos and how the instincts of a desperate man could imperil not only himself, but the innocent children he claimed to protect. Silver Creek would remember the standoff for years, a stark reminder of how fragile safety could be and how close ordinary streets could come to tragedy. The Colburn family, once shrouded in secrecy, became the center of a story that exposed the darkest edges of desperation, fear, and human survival.